Industrial Anthropology at Brandeis University in Boston, Massachusetts. She has just recently completed her 5-year research and dissertation and fieldwork on Shaligram practices in the Kali Gandhi region of Nepal. And she's worked not only in Nepal but also in India, Tibet, and small parts of Bhutan. Her work has been supported by the Fulbright Research Grant and Andrew Mellon Foundation Fellowship. She speaks English, German, Hindi, Nepali, and some gibberish.
Old Norse and Irish Gaelic.
Right. She's fluent in Hindi. She can read, write, speak, understand. She's watched, read more versions of Mahabharata and Ramayana than all of us put together. She has actually imbibed a lot of India and Nepal Shaligrams into herself. And that's why when I met her last year during my Kailash Yatra, I met her. I thought I should invite her in the temple. The Shaligram we have here in the temple was picked up by her, blessed at Muktinath, and she stayed there for a long time and completed her research. And I think the next 2 evenings, today and tomorrow, will be very interesting for all of us. So please welcome Holly.
So just as a quick rundown, I'm going to first of all try not to stand in front of this. I'll explain a little bit about what I want to do today and also what I want to do tomorrow to give you a little bit of kind of a structure of what I'm going for. So what I'm going to focus on for this talk is the history of Shaligram pilgrimage and practice, focusing mostly on the Kali Gandhi region of Mustang, Nepal, and also on India. And then the second thing my hope is to do is tomorrow I'm going to talk a lot more about Shaligram interpretive traditions, how to actually read Shaligram stones, and the sort of variations that go on in Shaligram Puja across several different traditions. It's also kind of interesting to note there is no single sort of overarching Shaligram tradition. There are actually about 7 of them. There's one in Nepal, there's one in Bhutan, there's one in Tibet, and there are several all across India. So part of what I'm going to try and make distinctions of is where some things are universal across Shaligram practice and where they sort of start to break off and vary and kind of at what time these things happened. And then at the end of this talk, and hopefully at the end of the talk tomorrow, I'm also going to have a sort of short little Q&A session. So if you do have questions, I'm more than happy to answer whatever questions I can. And sort of the last part, because I get asked this question quite a bit, throughout this presentation I will be referring to them as Shaligram. This is not a necessarily universal pronunciation. You will also often encounter Saligram and Saligrama. But simply for consistency's sake, I will refer to them as Shaligram, as Shaligram is also more consistent with the Sanskrit spelling of the word, which is clearly the Sha consonant with Akimatra. So I'll try and get through this hopefully as quickly as I possibly can so we can get to the Q&A. So we're going to actually start our story in Nepal. The region that I principally worked in during particularly this last year, which I actually just arrived in England yesterday morning, so I'm kind of jet lagged. But we're actually going to start the story in what's called Mustang District in the Kali Gandhi region of the Annapurna Conservation Area of northwestern Nepal, which is right actually on the border with Tibet. What's important to note about this, which is going to become an overarching theme of these talks, is that the area of Mustang, which encompasses the entire Kali Gandhi Valley, the Damodar Kund, which is the source of the Shaligram stones, is a very difficult political zone in Nepal. It was closed, and I mean completely closed off to all foreign travel in 1950 when China invaded Tibet. And for the most part, it remains reasonably politically closed off. There's still a lot of conflict in the region. It was the site of the Tibetan Khampa guerrilla resistance. It is still a site of the Tibetan resistance. And this has caused a fair amount of problems, particularly over the past 40 years or so, in Shaligram pilgrimage today. And one of the reasons for this is that in the early 1950s, Mustang District was literally cut in half. It was divided in half into Upper Mustang and Lower Mustang. Lower Mustang only opened to travel in 1992. So there is some accessibility of Lower Mustang, but the accessibility of Upper Mustang remains basically completely cut off. And unfortunately, the vast majority of the Kaligandaki region, including the Damodar Kund, which lies at about 8,000 meters, is in Upper Mustang. So what this functionally did in the 1950s was cut the Shaligram pilgrimage in half. The original Shaligram pilgrimage began in the village of Jomsom, which is in Lower Mustang, up to the village of Kagbeni, which is on the border between Upper and Lower Mustang, and then further north up into the Damodar Kund. That is now no longer possible. Therefore, at this point, Shaligram pilgrimage is a significant different entity than it was during its first inception. This is a picture of Mustang. It lies at about 4,000 meters in the high Himalayas, near the Tibetan Plateau. It's a very lovely place. It is very, very cold. And altitude sickness is unfortunately a big reality up there. So to give you an idea of where we're talking about, so I first came in actually down in Calcutta, which is down there, and then up into Kathmandu, and then up here, this is Mustang. The Kaligandaki basically goes right through the middle of it, and the holy site of Muktinath is right up here, right at the border with Upper and Lower Mustang. And I'm starting with the site of Muktinath because originally Muktinath was the midpoint of the Shaligram pilgrimage. It is now the end point of the Shaligram pilgrimage. And Muktinath, so you can sort of see here, the original pilgrimage began here in the village of Jomsom, and then up into Kagbeni, and then further north. It now goes from Jomsom to Kagbeni to Muktinath, and then back again. So it's a much, much shorter pilgrimage than it once was. This is the principal temple of Muktinath. This is the Vishnu Chandrazig Mandir. The area here, just to sort of give you an idea, once again, this is the end point of Shaligram pilgrimage, and we're sort of going to be working backwards. This is the Vishnu Mandir. The deity of Vishnu Chandrazig is in here. These are the two kunda, which begin the trip around Muktinath. So you begin by bathing in the first kunda. Back here, and I have a little bit better picture of it next, are the 108 sacred water spouts, which go in sort of a horseshoe shape around the back of the mandir. And you come up here, you go through the 108 water spouts, ending in the last kunda. And the vast majority of Shaligram pilgrims, when they have their Shaligram blessed at Muktinath, take the Shaligram with them as they traverse the 108 spouts. And then also enter the two kunda. Afterwards, then you take darshan at the temple, and that essentially now concludes the Shaligram pilgrimage. This is the deity of Muktinath. So Mukti meaning salvation, Nath meaning Lord. So this is Muktinath himself, who sits here. You'll notice the three Shaligrams which sit at his feet at this point. These are, by reputation, the first three Shaligrams ever found in the Kaligandaki River, and they predate the building of this temple by quite a number of centuries at this point. And he's flanked on either side by his consorts Sarasvati and Bhumi. These are the 108 water spouts. They are profoundly cold to go through. Even when, you can sort of see when I took this photo, it was in April and there's snow still up there, so it's a bit of an experience. But what is interesting about these particular water spouts, there is no plumbing involved in this. These are directly sitting up next to the mountain, of which there is an aquifer. There's a holy spring right behind them. So all of this water is actually coming straight out of the side of the mountain, and then it flows past here and then back down. This is the entrance to the temple of the Jwalamai. This is the second part of the history of Muktinath. Inside of this temple is the holy flame. This is a flame which is produced by a natural gas vent in the mountain, so it's actually coming up right out of the rocks. So on one side you have the holy water, on the second side you have the holy flame, which is then abutted on each side by the sacred sky, and then also by the Kaligandaki and Shaligram below. So in this case it becomes earth, air, water, and fire. All produced by the mountain. And this is the Jwalamai itself.
Sorry, what is this?
This is the Jwalamai. This is the mother flame.
Oh, okay.
Which is inside that temple. What I found sort of profoundly interesting about this part, so the Jwalamai also forms part of the Shaligram pilgrimage, but the aquifer is actually running right past it. So you have water flowing out of the rocks, of which there is fire coming directly out of it. And now this part, as you complete the trek around Muktinath, This is the Yagya Shala, which is found near the entrance of Muktinath. So this is the place where shaligrams, particularly shaligrams that families are no longer able to care for, are ritually retired. So they will be brought here, they are cared for by a resident priest who does puja twice a day. And you can also see, so there are these 3 shaligrams right here. They're quite large, they're about that big. These are the shaligram representations of Muktinath himself. So you have Sri Muktinath, who's represented right here, flanked on either side by shaligrams of Saraswati and Bhumi. The retired shaligrams themselves are right here. So that's what that is. They will remain in this temple for about 15 to 20 years, where they essentially live out the finality of their retirement. Afterwards, he will gather them up, they will be returned to the river. And essentially live again as they reappear out of the river and are picked up by a new family of pilgrims, and they begin their life cycle over again. This is sort of the important part that I want to get to about the life of shaligram. Shaligrams are most particularly important in Hindu practice because they literally live a karmic life. They are born out of the river, they are taken home by their new family, by the new pilgrim. They are incorporated into the life of the family the same way that a deity is. They're a little bit different, and I'll get into why that is. They then live with their family, often for many generations at a time. So they are very typically given at weddings. They're used during funerals. They are passed on to children, particularly eldest children. Sometimes shaligram collections, if they're large enough, can be split between multiple children. And then they will continue to live generation after generation within a family life. When that ends, there's essentially 2 things that happen with shaligram. Oftentimes shaligrams are used in cremations, where a particular shaligram, generally a favorite or a principal shaligram, will be given into the hands of the dead. When the dead is placed on the cremation, they are cremated together. Then the ashes and the shaligram will be returned to the river in the same way. The shaligram then carries the soul back to God, back to Vaikuntha, and then the shaligram will return back into the river to be reborn and begin its karmic life again. Why that's sort of particularly important is a number of reasons. Many of the shaligram families that I have worked with who've had shaligrams for, say, 4, 5, 6 generations can actually tell the story of their families in terms of the story of the shaligram that they carry. So this can be, for example, someone might say, my great-great-great-great-grandfather first went on shaligram pilgrimage in 1850. This was the deity who came home with him, and he passed it on to his eldest son, who passed it on to his daughter, who passed it on to her eldest son, and down and down and down, and this is how the shaligram has come with us, and I will pass it on to my son or to my daughter after I pass. The way this all comes about is sort of in 2 parts. The main portion of the pilgrimage is focused on this, and this is the Kali Gandaki River itself. It gets its name from the black silts that run underneath it, hence the Black River. It is also often referred to as the Krishna Gandaki. Sort of depends on which part of the country that you come from. You can also see it's an absolutely gorgeous place. It's a very strange, very meaningful place. On pilgrimage, this is the village of Kadmani. So when you are actually on pilgrimage, this is where you are. This is the bed of the Kali Gandaki River. So as you're coming up from Jomsom to Kadmani and then on again, these are where the shaligrams will appear, is in this area. This area is over half a mile wide. So it's quite a lengthy trip. That is Mount Nilgiri in the back there. Now, normally, so I'm actually standing in slightly across the border in Upper Mustang when I took this, facing, looking south. Normally, when you would have come up to Kadmani, coming up this river valley, you would have continued on north towards the Damdar Kund. Now, you will actually turn going up into this area where Muktinath is. So it's shifted a little bit. And then this is also Kadmani, this is now facing the other direction. So you can see how large the riverbed actually is, and this is Kali Gandaki. When you're actually on pilgrimage, these are the areas where the shaligrams will appear. As the river moves back and forth across the bed, it will continuously churn up new shaligrams which are coming down from Damdar Kund. This is unfortunately one of the only decent pictures of Damdar Kund I could get. It's heavily restricted, it's very hard to get to, it's at over 8,000 meters. So if you're doing the pilgrimage to this scale, it is roughly the same as summiting Everest. You're only a few hundred meters less than Everest. But this is where they originally come from. So the shale beds are up in here, and then this is a glacial lake which cuts down into them and then flows out to become Kaligandaki. So this begins sort of, how does Shaligram become Shaligram? And this is also one of the focuses of my work. How does Shaligram become Shaligram? Or most specifically, what is Shaligram, and how do we answer that question? When the fossils first begin to appear out of the shale beds, this is what they look like. They're recognizably very, very different than what you see up here in front of you. Most notably, they appear orange. They're sort of orange and red. You can vaguely see the black stone underneath them, but they also have very jagged edges. They're not particularly clear. This ammonite fossil, this is an ammonite fossil, has not yet become Shaligram. It is on its way. It must be born out of the river first to be truly Shaligram. So in the discourses of science, what this is called an ammonite. And an ammonite is an extinct form of cephalopod, so it's related to squid and the cuttlefish. Its closest relative is the chambered nautilus. They date to about 165 to 175 million years old. They originate in the Spiti shale beds of the Tibetan Plateau. And they originate specifically from a time before Nepal and India were joined. So 175 million years ago, the base of Nepal was sort of here, the Indian subcontinent was down here. Between them was a shallow ocean called the Tethys Sea. And this is where these particular ammonites originate from, is from the base of this ocean. As India began to move up, meets with the base of Nepal, up go the Himalayas, and at that point, what was once at the bottom of the ocean is now at the top of the mountain. And as they begin to erode out of the mountain, they tumble down the side, they enter Kaligandaki, and their journey into Shaligram actually begins. So here you can see the difference. So this came from the upper part of the top of one of the Himalayan mountains. This is Shaligram, which came from the Kaligandaki River. So how do we sort of become Shaligram? Once it enters the river, it undergoes a transformation. And that transformation tends to take between 3,000 and 5,000 years, additional to what it has already traveled. Travels down the river, it becomes Shaligram in the course of its travels through the sacred river, and then it is reborn out of the base of the river to become the deity. One of the things that I note, particularly in my work, as most academics will tell you, there's what I think, and then there's what I can prove. And they're sort of two different things. What I can prove at this point is that the first textual reference to Shaligram by that name is in Atharva Veda. And Atharva Veda very specifically is not talking about a new practice. The lines referring to Shaligram do not say, for example, and we went to this place that we had never been before and discovered this thing that was happening. It is clearly talking about something that has long been established. So Shaligram practice clearly predates the writing of Atharva Veda, which places it at about 4,000 years old. So the first textual mention during the composition of Atharva Veda is between 1500 BC and 2000 BC, and it is already talking about Shaligram. Clearly Shaligram is then also referred to in many texts afterwards. It's talked about in the Puranas, it's talked about in the Shastras. One of the most famous commentaries on Shaligram is by Adi Shankara in his commentaries, where he first lays out the tradition of Shaligram which is going on at the time that he's writing. What that means, essentially, is that Shaligram practice is one of the oldest contiguous religious practices in human civilization. There is almost nothing that beats Shaligram practice in terms of actual contiguous time. Obviously, that means we can date other religious practices to ancient history, but those practices are no longer going on. Shaligram practice has clearly been going on for that entire amount of time and likely preceded the writing of the Vedas for some time before then. How long? Unfortunately, I don't know. There's very little archaeology done, virtually no archaeology done in Mustang, Nepal, very little archaeology done in North India. So we know that they knew about them, we know that there was practice. Exactly how far back it goes, again, I'm not really sure. What I think, however, shaligrams are also sacred in 2 other religions. So there's syncretism going on here. They're sacred in Buddhism. They are also sacred in a practice called Bon, or Bonpo. Bonpo is the indigenous shamanic practice of the high Himalayas. They also use shaligram. Their focus on shaligram has more to do with the 4 elements of Muktanath. Buddhism is very similar to Hinduism in this respect. They're often used as meditation stones. But that basically means, and this is what I hope one day to actually be able to figure out, is that as Vedic civilization began to expand out of the Indus Valley, what more than likely happened, so the Indus Valley is sort of down here, Mustang is up here, as it began to spread out, it encountered the Tharangla Pass, which is one of only 3 passes in the Himalayas that you can actually traverse. So the first time Vedic civilization encounters the pass, it crosses over and begins to move north. This is the time, I think, it first encounters shaligrams, and first encounters shaligram practice. So that would place shaligram practice probably even up to 1,000 to 1,500 years more than before the writing of the Dharma Veda. You'll recognize some of these, hopefully. These are one of the first set that I found in Kali Gandaki. And that sort of brings me to the second part, which I'm going to get into much more tomorrow. You'll notice from here, and also from those in front of you, shaligrams clearly don't all look alike. They're not all the same. That's a very important part of shaligram practice, is the interpretation of shaligrams, learning to read shaligrams, and learning to understand how the deity has come to take residence in this manifestation. Shaligram practice is primarily based on an early Vedic piece of theology called the Buddhi theology. It is the same theology that backs the Dasavatara, it's the same theology that backs the Utsavamurti, and it's the same theology that essentially backs the basic manifestations and differences in the appearance of God himself. In that way, each shaligram, based on its specific characteristics, is read as a different deity. There are roughly 82 different name type categories of shaligrams that exist. And what I've done, at least for the last part of my book at this point, is create a guide using the help of ritual specialists by a lot, is to actually create a guide that tells you how you can identify each specific shaligram, which deity is present, how you know which deity is present, and then discusses the various variations in shaligram interpretive tradition for that particular shaligram. And obviously each one there is also a separate deity. One of the more complicated parts of my research was actually attempting to compile this information. The vast majority of shaligram information is not written. There is certainly stuff available in the Vedic texts. There is information and commentaries available from sages. But as an actual practice, it's virtually entirely oral tradition. That oral tradition is in danger. And part of my hope for writing this book is in preserving these traditions before they're actually lost. So this means discussing not only the varieties of shaligram interpretive tradition, but the history behind it, the meaning behind it, and the explanation of how shaligram came to be. So part of what I also have is the different stories of shaligram origins, of which there are roughly 6. The oldest and most popular actually begins in the Dharma Veda and moves forward, talks about the birth of shaligram as, and hopefully some of you might have heard this story, as the relationship between Vishnu and Brinda, also called Tulsi, who is the wife of the demon Jalandhar. Basically, the short version of the story is that Vishnu is called upon by Shiva, as Shiva is attempting to defeat the world, or not Shiva, Jalandhar is attempting to conquer the world, at which Shiva stands up and says, I will defeat him, I will take him out. Shiva finds that he cannot do this, so he goes to Vishnu and says, Vishnu, how are we going to do this? He's destroying everything. And Vishnu says, not a problem. I will transform myself into Jalandhar. I will seduce his wife. The reason for this being is that it was the purity of his wife and her yogic practice that gave Jalandhar his power. Therefore, Vishnu carries this out. Jalandhar is defeated by Shiva. At which point, Brinda, or Tulsi, depending on which story you go with, curses Vishnu, saying, you have stolen this from me in order to defeat my husband. Therefore, I curse you into the form of stone, and I call you Shaligram. Vishnu essentially says, that's fine, that's all right, this is the way it is meant to be, and in that respect, you shall become Kaligandaki. You shall become the river out of which I shall be born. And that is the oldest version of the Shaligram creation story. There are several others after that, there's several variations of it. Most of them look very much like the original story, and then some look very different. But I do, very thankfully, have them recorded, and I have an entire chapter about the birth of Shaligram. One of the other stories, very quickly, is actually involves Krishna. Krishna and Vishnu, in this particular point, are the same person, who is cursed. Curses sort of play a big part in Shaligram. Who is cursed to become stone after a sage requests, essentially, that he come into the world, that he stay in the world in a permanent fashion so that he may be worshipped, which he agrees to, and is born from the river. This is one of the last pictures I took. So this is Kaligandaki. This is a kelp for Shaligram, which is now just appearing out of the river. And sort of what you'll notice is, essentially this entire photo is the same color. It gets a little washed out, it's actually a little bit darker than this. But what makes Shaligrams a little tricky in the river itself is that they are the same color as the silts that they are born from. So it's very easy to not be able to find them. Thankfully, once you sort of get an eye for it, they get a little bit more obvious. Now the last part of what I'm going to focus on very quickly is the threats to Shaligram practice and the threats to Shaligram pilgrimage as they are today. One part is the political aspect. It is very difficult to get to Mustang. You are still required to purchase permits, which are reasonably expensive in order to enter Lower Mustang. It is virtually impossible to get into Upper Mustang. This has made it such that each year there's only roughly about 3,000 to 5,000 pilgrims coming into Lower Mustang. That still seems like a lot. Prior to 1950, it was 3 times that. And it is getting worse. As the political situation in Nepal deteriorates, it becomes harder and harder to travel into Lower Mustang to actually be able to find Shaligram. The results of this are essentially twofold. It has given a rise to markets for the buying and selling of Shaligram stones. It's primarily considered a karmic sin to place a monetary price on a Shaligram stone. It should never be done. Therefore, the buying and selling of the stones is not a good idea. However, this may be the only possible way to get a Shaligram within 10 years from now. If you can't go on pilgrimage, the flow of Shaligrams stops. And in that case, if you do in fact have to go to a Shaligram seller, of which there are many, you could be looking to paying up between $350 to $1,000 US. That clearly cuts off the prospect of Shaligrams from most pilgrims. They simply will not be able to afford that. The second aspect that has happened is as the rise of Shaligram sellers has become more prominent and markets for buying and selling stones has become more prominent, Shaligram stones are now being sold on the tourist market. They're being sold to people who have no idea what they are. They're sort of a pretty trinket. They have a pretty fossil look to them. And in that case, they're very commonly broken. And this will involve reasonably large amounts of people out on the river with a hammer out on the Kaligandaki, smashing them into pieces. Obviously, that causes a secondary problem. But because of the rise of Shaligram markets, it is also leading merchants to go into the Kaligandaki River Valley and taking hundreds of thousands of stones out of the river. Between 1950 and, as far as I can document, between 1950 and 1977, the appearance of Shaligrams in the Kaligandaki has significantly dropped. At one point, you could go between Johnson and Cagbeny, and you might find 30, 40 of them at a time. Now, between Johnson and Cagbeny, you'll probably find about 5. So they are dropping from the river. The fix to that is a little difficult, because the question is, if you ban the movement of Shaligrams out of Nepal, you end Shaligram pilgrimage outright. So you can't do that necessarily, but then where do you draw the line? Do you say, you can only have 1 Shaligram? You can only have 5? At what point do you cut it off? And how do they enforce it? Like I said, Mustang Nepal is unfortunately, it's a political red zone. It's militarized, but it's not policed, generally speaking. So that's one of the main threats to Shaligram pilgrimage, One of the principal threats to Shaligram practice is the loss of the oral tradition. As practitioners begin to move outwards, as families begin to split, very commonly Shaligram practices are not passed down in the way that they were. This has led now to the reduction of actual Shaligram practices by more than 50% in the past 30 years. My hope is, in writing this material, in some way I can provide a foundation for the basic part of Shaligram documentation and Shaligram practice to be able to move outwards in absence of the stones themselves. Because, as you can see, so this is a Shaligram in a temple context in northern India, and this is a Shaligram seller who's cracked 1 in half. Of which I also have 2, which are right there, which I use as teaching examples for what happens when a Shaligram is broken. So clearly, the ritual stones are here. Those 2 Shaligrams up at the top have been broken, have been cracked. I mentioned very briefly about the general practice of Shaligrams. In fact, that they are brought in as deities, they are cared for in the home as living members of the family, and they are in fact born and die along with the generations of the family. This particular puja is being performed, this is in northern India, this is in West Bengal, so this is Gaudiya Vaishnava. This is Gaudiya Vaishnava puja done in a temple, where they have been brought in actually as the essence of the deities themselves. So these temple deities are large marble deities. Inside of those deities is essentially a small opening. These Shaligrams are placed in the inside of the deity as the deity's active essence. So instead of Utsav Murti, instead of the small celebratory Murti, the Shaligrams themselves are actually then taken out of the deity, and those are the ones that move around the community. This is very similar to this. This is the Udupi Shaligram. So this is now in South India. So they have one large Vaikuntha Shaligram, which is sitting there. That Shaligram is actually about that big. It's gorgeous. And these are the Karnali Shaligrams. So just a little bit of what I'm demonstrating in anticipation of tomorrow is the wide variety of temple contexts and home contexts that Shaligrams exist in.
That was Udupi Sri Krishna.
Udupi is that one.
Okay, the next one?
And this is Karnali.
Karnali.
Karnali. Yeah. And then this is a home shrine of a family that I worked with in Kathmandu. They have been worshipping Shaligrams for 8 generations. And they actually told me one sort of very wonderful story. The grandfather who was involved in the collection of most of these Shaligrams was actually sued by his elder brother for the custody of the Shaligrams after their father had passed. And what he revealed is that throughout India, roughly back 250 to 300 years ago, there is an entire line of lawsuits involving various custody arrangements for Shaligrams. And so it gives you an idea of how desperately important they are to families and how vital they are to the family narrative. So kind of to bring it all together, where does this sort of leave us? One of the arguments that I make is that not only is Shaligram deity, but the true meaning of Shaligram is the power of their mobility. They move in space and time. So not only have they moved across a vast amount of geological time, millions of years from the formation of the high Himalayas, and in fact are older than the Himalayas themselves, they also move in time. So they're moving throughout geological time, they're moving throughout mythological time, and they're moving through the lives of the practitioners themselves. They are living with us as part of our own story. The loss of Shaligram tradition, particularly in my opinion, would be a catastrophe. This is a practice that has been going on for at least 4,000 years, probably predating that, and is one of the oldest practices of human civilization. And it comes from Nepal and India. To lose these practices would be to lose a tremendous narrative that we have had since the beginning of our own civilization. And they have been with us ever since. So now I want to open it to questions. I know I went through that really fast, but it was a lot of material to cover. Obviously in the final book, which is actually written, I just need to revise it. I go into each one of these aspects in more detail, talk about the evidence behind it, and actually I go through in the last part a beginning to end Shaligram pilgrimage, such as it once was. So hopefully that will make more sense. Yeah.
Yeah, you said that, they can be burnt with the body.
Yes.
Do they get burnt or?
No, they look exactly like they do now. So when you gather up sort of the final ashes, the shaligram will be there, and it will look exactly as it does. They don't break, they don't burn.
Okay, how did that break then?
That was broken with a hammer.
Okay.
No, that was someone looking to get to the internal portion who actually smashed it.
Where does this term shaligram originate?
So there's a little bit of a debate about that, depending on whether you pronounce it shaligram, which is the Sanskrit pronunciation, or saligram. Generally speaking, most Sanskrit scholars have narrowed it down to meaning house stone. So it's shaligram shila. Shala is generally a place name, so it's understood that that was probably one of the original names of Kaligandaki, was the place of the shala tree, or the sala tree. Gram means house, and then shila means stone. So it's likely that it was a reference to the fact that stones were kept in the home, that these were household deities. The temple tradition probably didn't begin until later. Does that make more sense?
So now that there is so much demand for the shaligrams and there are so many sellers,
Yes.
how can you identify which is the real one, which is a duplicate? There will be so many coming
Tomorrow.
trying to sell them as.
Clarification is tomorrow, but that's a good question.
Yeah, how do you tell a real from a fake one?
Tomorrow.
Um,
Keep it interesting for tomorrow.
Yes, that's part of what I will explain tomorrow, is how you can tell the difference between a false shaligram and a real one.
Good question. But what, and very few people have access like this to you or somebody. So
Yes.
there will be many people who will be good. Just.
And it does. I have encountered a fair number of fake shaligrams, sort of in my travels. I guess for me, and this is probably because I've been doing it for so long, I can pick them out really fast. I can say it's like, no, not that one, yes, that one, no, not that one. But there are methods that you can use to actually figure out which is which. You had a question?
If the shaligrams are taken with the body for cremation, so you can find it in other parts of India, in the other riverbeds, if you look other than just the Kaligandaki river.
You probably can now. The Kaligandaki eventually meets up with the Ganges near a town called Trivikrani, which is on the border between Nepal and India. Shaligrams, regular shaligrams, have been reported as far south as Trivikrani. It's rare, but they do show up. But yes, if a cremation is done with a shaligram, it will then be born from the river again at some point, wherever that happens to be. But Kaligandaki and the Ganges meet up, so for most people, it's not a problem.
What?
Like, if somebody wants to go and they go to the river basin there. So how can they identify? Will they give them some training how to identify them? Correct the shaligram
Local
and
guides.
go for the.
For pilgrims?
Yeah.
No.
Then how will they may collect something and think that it's shaligram, go around the.
Usually the way it works, most pilgrims will travel in groups. Often they will travel with their guru or ritual specialist, who is trained and versed in shaligram identification. Because part of, at least my favorite part of the shaligram pilgrimage, you do your prayers before you enter the river. And then generally speaking, you might ask the river, oh, I want Sri Krishna, oh, I want Vishnu Narayan, I want to bring back Ganesha. Hopefully that happens for you. But generally speaking, the river speaks to you in whatever shaligrams begin to appear. So for example, many pilgrims, as they were going, they may have prayed for Sri Krishna. The first to appear is actually Shiva Linga. And now they need to understand why the river is speaking in that particular manner. So the narrative of the shaligram pilgrimage itself is wonderful. It's fascinating. But barring that, very often they will be taken back to a major temple or a major pilgrimage site. Pashupatinath is popular for this in Kathmandu, because you have to go through Kathmandu anyway, to actually have the shaligram identified. But for a lot of pilgrims who don't have access to the oral traditions, they don't know which ones they are. Yeah.
But, sir, let me ask you, such a huge place, 5 continents, and you are somewhere in America. How did you chance to get to study Shaligrama, that in a remote village, I would call it a village, in Muktina? What made you go there for all the places?
Purely by accident. I actually began working on this project back in 2012. So this entire project has been a little over 5 years now at this point. I was working in India at the time on a very different project. I was actually working on a project involving temple architecture and the care of deities in temples. It was by chance, I was working with a brahmacharya, and I happened to notice these black stones. I didn't know what they are. It's not something I've been working on Hinduism. I've been studying Hinduism for 4 years, even prior to that. Didn't know what they were, so I finally asked him, Rama, what are these stones? And he was the first to explain Shaligram to me at the time. What shocked me the most is for as long as I had been studying Hinduism, I hadn't heard that word. I had no idea what he was talking about. So I started documenting the Shaligram tradition among Gaudiya Vaishnavas of West Bengal. And when I returned home to the United States about 4 months later, I figured there's a book about this somewhere. Someone must have written something, articles or religious literature, like I'm going to go find out and I'm going to read more about it. Nothing. There was nothing available. All I had was Google, and that was terrible. So I said, that's okay, we have a South Asian Studies department, we have several Indian and Nepali historians, I will ask them. So I went to our South Asian Studies department, no idea what I was talking about. I think one of them basically said, yeah, I think my grandpa had one when I was a kid, but I don't know anything about it. So I was like, okay, well, that's sort of disappointing. So I went back to my PhD committee, explained what I had seen, explained that there was nothing in the literature. I had been able to find at that point a couple of pieces of pilgrimage literature, which generally aren't available online. They're only available in India and Nepal. And my PhD chair basically went, well, we know what you're doing for the next 3 years. So that's exactly what happened. Is I went back to India, I continued the work, just asking people, saying like, do you know someone who knows about Shaligram? Do you know a pilgrimage or a ritual specialist? And they were the ones who began to send me around to the right people. And basically by the end of it, everyone I spoke to said, well, if you really want to understand Shaligram, you have to go to Kali Gandaki. So I went to Nepal for the first time in 2015, and I've now just returned from another year in Nepal doing the exact same thing. So it's just where it went. I was not expecting it. I didn't know at the time what I was doing. I just followed where it took me.
Hari, do you have a question?
Yeah. What kind of tradition or puja or purity that we need to follow whenever we have Shaligram at home?
It depends. So there are a variety of different Shaligram pujas depending on the particular tradition that you come from. And this is another thing that I'll talk about also in a little bit more detail tomorrow. There is a general thread across all of them which is similar. They basically vary in the details. But generally speaking, most Shaligram scholars will say the basics of care is relatively simple. First of all, Shaligram is never invoked. The deity is always present and self-manifest. So you do not call the deity forward nor send them away. They are always there. So that part is cut out. But in a home context, it's basically said that the minimum of care is to offer Shaligram water and tulsi or water and flowers every morning, and that's it. The more elaborate pujas tend to happen during important times, such as festivals, marriages, funerals. Generally in that respect, it's a bit more of an elaborate puja, but the basics of care are very simple.
I'm more interested in this kind of research. One of my friends was doing it when he was living in Nepal, then that one transferred to US.
Okay.
And then the connection got cut. Is there any way wherein we, maybe as a group, can be in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
And take a look at your book and do what kind of research that you are doing?
Oh, absolutely. I certainly hope so. I mean, the Nepali version, the more widespread Nepali version is Panchatana Puja. In other parts, particularly in northern India, it's a bit more simplified than that. It becomes more elaborate, for example, among the Madhwas Brahmins. It's also, again, simplified in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, and then it becomes, again, much more complicated in temple contexts as far south as like Chennai.
Sriram,
Thanks for your presentation, I enjoyed it. A question regarding, if you are a PhD in this topic, I don't think there's anybody better than you in Shaligram research than yourself. How could you ever even sit an exam? It's a curiosity question. If there's nobody else in this world who's probably done enough research on Shaligram, who's going to be your supervisor to certify that you are a PhD in this?
My guess
it's a purely
is...
curiosity, it's not
No, it's something I've thought about myself.
Thing. How could somebody even assess your massive research you've done on this.
Can I
When they
take
have
a-
absolutely little knowledge on Saligram.
Can I take a photo on that? We all go to appraisal, most of us go to appraisal.
Yes.
The appraiser in front of us hasn't got a clue what we do. Have you done research? Yes. Where is the evidence? That's my research. Have you done audit? Yeah, done. Have you done that? Yeah. Have you spoken to your patient? Yeah.
Yeah.
done. That's it. Research methodology could be assessed rather than the research topic itself. It's just a bit of a. Yes.
So my defense, which has been set, my defense has been set for May of 2018. So I have exactly 1 year from now to completely finish the book and pick up my PhD. My chair, my committee chair, has basically said, we're not even going to try to examine you on your knowledge of Shaligram. We'll ask around. Hopefully there'll be some available ritual specialists that we can talk to, but we're not even going to try. Basically what my examination is going to follow is my use of theory, my use of sources, ensuring that I am adequately representing the voices of the community themselves rather than my own voice, and also the response people have had to this work, which is generally important in anthropology and the social sciences in general. So if you publish a work and the actual community that you're working with is like, this person is an idiot, like we have no idea what they're talking about, you're going to get hit pretty hard. But if the response is generally favorable, I mean, you can have dissent, and we expect that, and that's fine. But if the response is generally like, yes, this sounds like something that comes from our community, this is what we would say, this is how we want to be represented, you're generally okay.
So it's documentation of evidence, all the recordings and everything
Yes.
will go a big way then.
Yes. I mean, I have to be very careful about citing my sources, discussing who have I spoken with, what were their perspectives, how,
Genuinity of each one.
right, so that, like I said, so someone isn't reading it being like, no one from West Bengal would say this, or no ritual specialist would say that. And that the representation, like I said, is authentic to the people I'm actually working with, and not just me writing whatever I feel like writing.
Sorry. 2-3 questions?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Now you showed one huge one in one temple. So, huge Shaligram one.
Yeah.
How big can it go? Size?
The largest Shaligram which is known is in the Jagannath Temple of Orissa, and it is the size of a Volkswagen.
Wow. My goodness.
It's beautiful. I don't have a photo of it because you're not allowed to photograph it, but it's basically the size of this table, for the most part. It's a huge Sudarshan, it's a huge spiral.
And in India, no, they have habits of doing carvings. Have somebody tried doing some carvings on them?
I actually have two, which are sitting right there. There is a traditional Shaligram carving, where generally speaking, yeah, go ahead and see them. Generally speaking, the face of the Shaligram is left intact, and then you turn it over and you actually do a deity murti on the back. I have two of them over there. One is Shiva and one is Vishnu.
In about 5 minutes, we'll have puja talks, so you're free.
I'm just saying, but have you updated the Google and Wikipedia based on your knowledge? Was that like
Not yet.
Yeah.
No.
How do you do that?
I can. Basically what I want to do is I want to finish revising
Okay.
so that I'm sure that I'm saying
Yeah,
what I want to
it's
say.
useful because somebody Googling now can look at your sort of what you're saying. It's more.
That was the window.
Other thing maybe, like, not disclosing too much of your research presentation, if it is. They can have your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, there is some information available, for example, in Wikipedia. Most of it's not very good.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying, we can update Wikipedia, Google and YouTube, so that like.
Yes, and that's my hope.
Yeah, that will be useful, like.
And I do, and I want to make sure, what I'm doing right now is I do have a fieldwork blog where I do discuss most of this information, available at least online in some form. Once I'm actually able to publish the book, I have a reference that I can make, so I can update everything and say, here's the citation.
Reference.
Otherwise, right now, they would just be like, who are you, and why are you updating yourself?
So we can do that. Yeah, the other thing is, what about, like you said about tradition, you don't want this tradition to go away and something. What are suggestions how this tradition can be revived or,
I think one of the big parts, it's going to sort of be two-part, I think. The first is actually getting the information available, so that people, whether you live in India, Nepal, or whether you now live in UK or the United States or Australia, you have something to actually work from, that it's available to you without having to find someone back in India or Nepal. The second part, honestly, is going to be the passing down of the tradition again, reviving the generational use of shaligrams in families. And I think getting the information out is going to go a long way to doing that.
Okay, thank you. In general, the shaligram generally will generate a lot of positive energy.
Yes.
Okay, but there was an argument with my friend where he said that in case due to some reason the shaligram was accidentally broken or broken with kind of adverse effects,
Yes.
it may generate negative energy. Is that true?
Generally speaking, yes. The shaligram, which is why I sort of brought the two here, the household shaligram, the temple shaligram, should be a whole stone, an unblemished and unbroken stone. Those two there, usually if I encounter a broken stone, I will return it back to Kaligandaki. Those two I keep essentially for teaching purposes to demonstrate what happens when they're broken, but you would not want to keep those two stones for puja.
Can I just ask? So some of these from a distance, they look like just pebbles, but virtually each one has got some sort of mark, like an ammonite.
Yes, which is what I'm going to get into tomorrow.
So there is a difference between a pebble and...
Yes, those are two different deities.
Yeah, okay.
The one that you just picked up there, that is a Jagannath shaligram.
Okay.
Whereas this one, this is Damodar. This is Damodar shaligram. And the ones completely unmarked, so one like this and sort of those down there, these are Krishna shaligrams. So this is Santan Gopala, and that is Sri Krishna, right there.
But this is got the same thing as
And
Damodar.
yeah, those are both Damodar shaligrams. So there's actually three of them. So these are three Damodar shaligrams.
Why do some of these have cushions?